Right now, if your fridge stopped working, you'd be annoyed for maybe a day. If the grocery store closed for a week, you'd start Googling, how long can humans survive without food? You have a backup for everything: insurance, savings, a pantry, a phone that can order you dinner in 12 minutes. Now, take all of that away. Not metaphorically. Actually take it away. No agriculture, no stored grain, no domesticated animals waiting in a pen for you, no calendar telling you when the seasons will turn. You wake up every single day of your life not knowing where your next meal is coming from, and you have known this uncertainty since the day you were born because everyone you have ever met has lived exactly the same way. This was the human condition for over 290,000 years. Agriculture, the thing that built cities, governments, and eventually Uber Eats, has only existed for about 12,000 of those years, which means for roughly 96% of human history, our ancestors were doing something that sounds, on paper, completely insane. They were surviving, thriving, and spreading across every continent on Earth with no farms, no stockpiles, and no safety net except each other. So how did that actually work? Not the textbook version, the real version. Let's get into it. Start with the most basic problem. Food doesn't just sit around waiting for you in nature. It moves, it hides, it's seasonal, and half of it is trying not to be eaten. Ancient humans solved this the same way a good freelancer solves an unpredictable paycheck. Diversify your income stream. Except here, the income streams were roots, berries, nuts, insects, shellfish, fish, and, when the group got lucky, meat from an animal that took real coordination to bring down. This is the part people get wrong. They picture ancient humans as constant hunters, spears in hand, chasing mammoths across the tundra. In reality, gathering did most of the heavy lifting. In most hunter-gatherer societies ever studied, plant foods gathered mostly by women and older children provided the majority of daily calories. The dramatic mammoth hunt was the exciting side quest. The actual main quest was knowing in obsessive encyclopedic detail exactly which plants in your territory were edible this week, which were poisonous, which needed to be soaked or cooked to remove toxins, and which were about to come into Season 3 valleys over. That knowledge wasn't instinct, it was an oral library, thousands of data points passed down through direct teaching generation after generation with zero margin for error. Get one mushroom wrong and you don't get a bad Yelp review. You get a funeral. And here's the twist that should genuinely unsettle you. This means ancient humans, on average, likely knew more usable, real-world botany than most people alive today with a phone in their pocket and unlimited access to Google. We didn't get smarter. We got outsourced. Now let's talk about the hunting, because when it happened, it was nothing like the movies. Early humans were not physically capable of simply overpowering a bison or a horse. No claws, no real speed, no natural weapons worth mentioning. What they had instead was patience and a plan, which, it turns out, is a devastating combination. Persistence hunting is one of the oldest strategies we know of, and it is almost unbelievably simple. Humans can sweat to cool down. Most four-legged prey animals can't. They have to stop and pant. So a small group would simply keep an animal moving, hour after hour in the heat of the day, never letting it rest long enough to cool off, until eventually the animal collapsed from heat exhaustion, and the humans, who had been jogging this entire time, walked up and finished the job. Think about that for a second. Our ancestors didn't out-muscle the animal kingdom. They out-endured it. The scrawniest, slowest predator on the savannah won by simply refusing to stop walking. That's not a nature documentary. That's the plot of a horror movie from the antelope's point of view. And persistence hunting needed backup. You can't finish off an exhausted animal with your bare hands and good intentions, so this is where tools come in, and this is another place where the popular picture is way off. People imagine early stone tools as clumsy rocks. They weren't. Knapping a stone tool properly requires understanding fracture mechanics, how force travels through a material, which angle produces a clean edge versus a shattered mess. Nobody wrote this down. It was taught hand over hand, generation after generation, refined constantly, the same way a skilled machinist today understands metal without ever opening a textbook on material science. And these weren't one-off tools either. Ancient toolkits specialized. One tool for skinning, one for scraping hide, one for cutting sinew, one for working wood. That's not survival by luck. That's an entire manufacturing tradition, running continuously for over 2 million years, long before anything we'd recognize as civilization existed. But food is only half the survival equation, because knowing what to eat doesn't help you if you're dead from exposure in 3 days. Shelter and clothing mattered just as much, and this is where things get genuinely clever. Early shelters weren't caves. Despite what every cartoon has told you, caves are rare, often already occupied by something with teeth and usually damp and cold. Most groups built their own structures from branches, hides, and whatever the local landscape offered, angled specifically to shed rain and block wind, designed and redesigned constantly based on what worked last time and what didn't. This wasn't guesswork. It was generations of trial, error, and brutal feedback, refined into something closer to engineering than people usually give it credit for. Clothing tells a similar story. Turning an animal hide into something wearable takes real multi-step processing, scraping, stretching, treating, sometimes smoking, over day. That means someone, tens of thousands of years ago, had to think about a problem that didn't exist yet. The animal is alive today. The coat you need doesn't exist until next week. That's not a reflex, that's planning across time, which, if you think about it, is one of the more underrated superpowers of being human. Here's where it gets even crazier. None of this, the food knowledge, the hunting strategy, the shelter design, the clothing tech, worked without the group. Survival on your own, for any real length of time in genuinely hostile conditions, was almost impossible. So human groups functioned less like a collection of individuals and more like a single organism with specialized parts. Some members focused on gathering, some tracked and hunted. Elders no longer able to keep pace physically became the walking archive, the ones who remembered where the water was during the last bad drought, which plants healed a wound, which berries looked friendly, but weren't. Losing an elder wasn't just an emotional loss. It was losing an entire reference library with no backup copy, which is probably why caring for the old and the sick shows up in the archaeological record far earlier than most people assume. It wasn't just kindness, it was the group protecting its own hard drive. And children weren't a burden to be managed, they were the next generation of the archive, being trained in real time through observation, mimicry, and frankly, getting things wrong under low-stakes supervision until they got it right. There was no school. There was just watching your mother identify a route and then trying it yourself while she corrected you. Now, let's talk about something almost nobody brings up: movement. Ancient humans weren't wandering aimlessly. Their entire lives were built around a mental map so detailed it would put your phone's GPS to shame. Except this map lived entirely in memory, refreshed constantly, and shared across the group like a living document. They knew exactly where the seasonal water sources were, where certain plants would fruit in 6 weeks, where predators tended to den, and where the last group that came through this valley left useful information carved into a tree or scattered as tool debris. This is the part that should really land. Every single decision, where to camp tonight, which direction to travel tomorrow, whether to risk crossing that river, was made using a working memory of an entire ecosystem, built up over a lifetime and cross-checked against what previous generations had already learned. There was no room for error because there was no rescue helicopter. Get the map wrong in the wrong season, and the consequence wasn't inconvenience. It was starvation. Here's the part that tends to surprise people the most, though. The kind of fact that quietly rewires how you think about your own week. When anthropologists actually sat down and timed how many hours hunter-gatherer groups spent obtaining food, the number wasn't 12 hours a day of grinding, desperate labor. In several well-studied groups, it landed somewhere around 15 to 20 hours a week. That's less than a part-time job. The rest of the time went to rest, socializing, storytelling, tool maintenance, and frankly, napping. Compare that to your average work week, and sit with the discomfort of that comparison for a second. The image of ancient life as constant, miserable scrambling turns out to be less historical fact and more modern projection. Us assuming that because they had less stuff, they must have had less time. They didn't. They just spent it differently, on people, on stories, on rest instead of on a screen. And yet, they didn't just survive this. They thrived in it, spreading from the plains of Africa into deserts, rainforests, tundras, and eventually across oceans on nothing but wood, rope, and observation. Getting to places like Australia meant deliberately crossing open water, out of sight of land, with no compass, no map, and no guarantee anything was even out there. That's not an accident. Nobody drifts 60 miles by accident. Someone looked at an empty horizon, built a raft anyway, and decided the unknown was worth the risk. That single decision, repeated in different forms across the planet, is basically the entire story of our species. Every single environment on this planet, no matter how brutal, was eventually cracked by a group of humans who had no textbooks, no supply chains, and no fallback option except each other and everything they had already figured out. So here's the thing that should stick with you. We tend to imagine our ancestors as primitive, one step removed from animals, stumbling through history until agriculture finally showed up and saved them. But that's backward. Agriculture didn't rescue humanity from a failing system. It replaced a system that had already worked brilliantly for 250,000 years, one built entirely on memory, patience, cooperation, and an almost unbelievable tolerance for uncertainty. You have a fridge, you have a grocery store, you have a phone that remembers everything so you don't have to. And somewhere behind all of that convenience is a very long, very quiet inheritance from people who had none of it, who survived anyway, who figured it out first, one uncertain, hungry, ordinary day at a time.